Welcome to Good Life. This is Dean Wilson, and I have a special guest today. Dr. Paul Willis is with me. Dr. Willis has been a professor at Westmont College for 32 years. He's a phenomenal poet. It's a fascinating discussion. I think you're really going to enjoy it, so stay tuned. Good Life is next. This is Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. I'm so glad you've joined us today. We have a special guest, a professor from Westmont College. Dr. Paul Willis is with us. Dr. Willis is a professor. He's also a phenomenal poet. He was actually the poet laureate of Santa Barbara from 2011 to 2013. Been a professor of English at Westmont College for 32 years. Has written a number of books that we'll get into, but he's a wonderful writer, and he's a wonderful man. And so we're delighted to have you, Dr. Willis. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Dean.
32 years at Westmont. I did have you, we talked about this earlier, but I did have you for one writing class, which was fun, a lot of fun. I've actually enjoyed writing. I told everybody before we started here that your comment to me that I'll never forget is, you read a lot of sports pages growing up, didn't you? So
Yeah.
You figured my style out, which apparently I got from reading sports pages. But that was a fun class. I really enjoyed it, and my wife was an English major at Westmont. But actually where I wanted to start was, in 32 years at Westmont, what's changed? How is it different? What's grown? What's maybe gone backwards, forwards? What's been that road like?
It's hard to tell. You forget things in 32 years. I think certainly the faculty has gotten stronger in terms of their scholarly abilities, their publishing, but at the same time I don't think we've lost that desire to be in personal touch with our students.
Yeah.
So that's been nice to see.
Yeah.
And obviously the faculty and the student body have become more diverse as well.
Yeah.
Over 32 years, and that's I think deepened and broadened me. I look out on the classroom and I think not all these people came from my family, and
Right.
and so we want to work hard to make sure everyone's represented and noticed and included and understood, and
Yeah, that's good.
of course still working on that.
Right.
This summer, that's particularly come to the fore.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've been on a couple of the calls with President Beebe at Westmont, and it's been just refreshing to hear his perspective, humility, and desire to continue to grow. And I think it's wonderful when, Westmont's a great place. It was a life-changing experience for me. My mom went there, graduated in 1967, met my wife there, my brothers went there, now I have a daughter there. And it's a wonderful place, and that doesn't mean that it stops growing.
That's right.
And that doesn't mean that it doesn't have problems, because it's full of humans.
I've heard.
Right. So there's going to be some problems.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated Dr. Beebe's desire to see Westmont grow in its openness, diversity, love. Has that been kind of your experience as a faculty member? I'm sure you've been involved in some of those conversations, but how has it been?
Well, every year is different. You just try to be present for the people you're with. I would say one thing I've seen in 32 years is, with the advent of all different kinds of personal technologies,
Right.
there's something you have to fight in terms of attention span.
Right.
And
Do they have phones? The students have phones in the classroom?
well, you try to keep them out, but they keep popping in. It's like these cell phones are medically attached
Right,
to their
right,
hands, and
right.
and I understand they're wonderful devices, but I wonder if it, and this isn't just Westmont, it's just a whole generation of folks. Since I'm in literature, and you want to get people invested and involved, and soaking in long, rich texts.
Right.
And I just sometimes wonder if we're losing
That.
as a culture
Yeah.
that ability to focus for
Right.
some length of time.
That's a great question.
So
I mean, just sitting down and reading a book.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's an interesting thought. I loved hearing last night you on a video of one of your lectures or talks or interviews or something, but you the essay, I guess it is, about your grandfather. I
okay.
thought it was fascinating. He was an orange grove farmer
Yeah, down in Anaheim.
in Anaheim.
Uh-huh.
Did he really sell it to Disney, the land, or no?
Well, at the time that Disney came in, he sold his land when the
Okay.
land prices were
Okay.
going up.
Okay,
yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
I thought that was such an interesting essay,
Yeah.
and how you were 2 years old. I mean, your youngest memory was his green chair,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about, and then I guess there was a flood, and he was carrying family members.
Yeah, my mom. Mhm.
Your mom.
Yeah.
I'll have that picture with me, I think, for a while. How do you, when did that strike you that I want to write an essay about my grandfather?
Yeah, actually, it was a poem that came first, and I don't know. Maybe I could read it because it's the only poem of mine that Garrison Keeler ever chose and read on the radio.
And I heard about that too. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we could.
Yeah, let me dig it out
If you
here.
can find it.
I think it's
Yeah,
in
I
this
did
book.
also hear the Garrison Keeler story of when you met him in person, by the way.
Oh, right.
But he actually read this poem on the radio.
He did a couple of times on his Writer's Almanac. And the interesting thing is he actually read it twice. I thought he would just punch the tape,
He read it.
He reread it.
Wow.
So I'll read it here. It's called Common Ground.
Yeah, please.
Today, I dug an orange tree out of the damp black earth. My grandfather bought a grove near Anaheim at just my age. Like me, he didn't know much. How'd you learn to grow oranges, Bill? Friends said. Well, he said, I look at what my neighbor does and I just do the opposite. Up in Oregon, he and his brother discovered the Willamette River. They were both asleep on the front of the wagon. The horses stopped. His brother woke up. Will, he said, am it a river? My grandfather, he cooked for the army during the war, the first one. He flipped the pancakes up the chimney. They came right back through the window onto the griddle. In the Depression, he worked in a laundry during the night, struck it rich and pocket knives. My grandfather, he liked to smoke in his orange grove, as far away on the property as he could get from my grandmother, who didn't approve of life in general, him in particular. Smoking gave him something to feel disapproved for, set the world back to rights. Like everyone else, my grandfather sold his grove to make room for Disneyland. He laughed all the way to the bank, bought in town, lived to see his grandsons born, and died of cancer before anyone wanted him to, absent now in the rootless presence of damp black earth.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I couldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Sports writer like me.
Yeah.
That is so beautiful.
Well, yeah, it started. I was digging up an orange tree in our home in Carpinteria where we lived, and I thought, I bet my grandfather did this a lot.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Now, your first book memory as a young boy was you're 6 years old, and you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
That's right.
Took you 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And you said, I think the coolest thing that I could do is write a story like that.
Yeah, it was a very distinct thought. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And what happened? What happened after that? You won a contest. I read that, Mrs. Weir.
Oh.
I read that. I heard that story. Great story. Have you forgiven Mrs. Weir, by the way? We won't tell the story. But talk about your journey as a young boy and man and this kind of love that you had for writing, that you have?
Yeah, well, I loved to read as a young kid, and I think good writing comes out of good reading, and once in a while I'd try to write something. I often wrote letters and postcards to my grandmother,
You did?
who wasn't well educated and had no basis whatever on which to encourage me, but she encouraged me more than anyone.
Really?
Yeah. And
specifically your writing?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think it's important to encourage children. I know that at the village, the apartments for low-income folks that you run, that you have reading and writing clubs, and I've had students who've helped with those, and they've brought me in a little bit. It's just beautiful to watch those young kids writing and feeling proud of their writing, and I think those experiences are real important. Yeah. I mean, obviously, as I got a little older, I got more intelligent criticism and so forth. But it wasn't always encouragement. Sometimes it was the opposite. I went to Wheaton College in Illinois, and Madeline L'Engle was a frequent visitor, and she told us that her famous novel A Wrinkle in Time was rejected 39 times.
Really?
And so when I was shopping around my first novel, I think it got rejected 25, 26 times, but I thought, I'm not up to 39, so
wow.
I'm good. But
and if you hadn't heard that, you may have given up.
Yeah, but I didn't. In college, I don't think I impressed anyone with my writing. I had I tried. I was getting used to the idea. I had a creative writing teacher for a couple classes, and I remember before I graduated, I ran into him on campus, and I said, hey, could you tell me about graduate opportunities in writing or literature? I just don't know much, maybe could you point me in a direction? And he said, well, I've heard in the summer that you teach climbing in Yosemite. And I said, oh, that's right. I was sort of proud that he knew, because I was very proud of doing this. And then he said, that's probably a pretty good job for you. and then he turned around and walked off. So I probably spent the whole rest of my life trying to prove him wrong.
Right. Well, and that brings up an interesting point. Nature. You have this fondness for nature, and I think and I actually read somebody who reviewed one of your poetry books, the book Visiting Home.
Okay.
He said that in his review, he said that you, Dr. Willis, ask us to consider how nature brings us closer to our spiritual home in God.
Mm.
I thought that was an interesting thought. And I know you spent a lot of time in the North Cascades, and but talk about kind of nature and what happens to you that's different when you're out in nature, and how it affects your writing.
Yeah, well, who knows? I grew up in Oregon, and we lived on the edge of a university-owned forest outside of Corvallis, and I just sort of instinctively would explore that from a young age, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes even overnight by myself, and I just felt a sense of at-homeness then, and then got a little older, and my brother and I started climbing peaks in the Oregon Cascades, and it was very exciting, and and we got into guiding trips and so forth. But I think it wasn't till later that I brought a little sort of theological understanding to this, in some cases. I mean, the early church fathers talk about God giving us two books, the book of the scriptures and the book the book of nature.
Hmm.
And there is something about the way God reveals himself to us in nature. When I was in graduate school, I wrote my dissertation on how Shakespeare uses forests in his plays. And interesting, there's a pattern. About a third of his plays, a significant action takes place in the forest. And what always happens is when characters go into the forest, they're exposed for who they really are. You know, if they're really good people, but that's sort of hidden or obscured in a corrupt court setting, it comes to the fore out in the forest. You know, if they're cowardly people, if they're bad people, and that's been obscured in the court of the city, that becomes obvious in the forest. And then if it's a comedy, there's something about being in the forest that helps that exposure of character become change of character. You know, it becomes a arena of forgiveness and grace and community coming together again, and then they can go back to the court of the city and be better adjusted. In a tragedy, it's usually too late to change, but the forest becomes a place, a vantage point from which characters can see their lives and the lives of others more clearly, sort of a tragic vision. So who knows? It's an ongoing mystery. I know that not everyone is loves to immerse themselves in the wilderness, but it's always been life-giving for me.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
The poem book, Say This Prayer Into the Past, is one. I'll mention now, before I forget, your newest book, which is All in a Garden Green. Tell us real quickly kind of how this came to be.
Yeah. Well, just having talked about nature, that's probably the least nature-y book I've ever written. But at Westmont, in the English department, we take our students every other fall for a semester of study in England. And my wife and I and our two young kids, they were just 5 and 7 at the time, took, I think, 21 students to England years ago. And we stayed in a Tudor manor house, a 16th century manor house that's now a Catholic retreat center run by a group of nuns, Hengrave Hall in Suffolk, in the southeast part of England. Stayed there for most of the semester. And the place had quite a history, and afterwards I did some research on it, and I wrote this young adult time travel novel where, you know, kids they walk through the wrong door, and there's a resident composer, and one girl is mistaken for the daughter of the family, and Queen Elizabeth is about to visit, and they're a Catholic family and she's Protestant, and they have to figure out how to entertain her. And so this girl that goes back in time helps out in entertaining the Queen, but also gets herself in all sorts of trouble. It's a little bit of a window on these really deep conflict, Catholic-Protestant conflict at the time.
Wow.
But there's a way in which the performance of music sort of resolves or transcends that conflict for the moment. There's a little bit of hopefulness in that.
Yeah.
So mostly I just had fun writing it.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
All in a Garden Green, and I've heard that there's a sequel on the way, so that's wonderful. You said you call yourself, I mean, your main writing is poetry, and you've done some novels, and then I think one of your colleagues at Westmont once encouraged you to not forget about the essay.
That's right.
And I saw in one of your videos you described what the word essay means, or something about to try, or to...
Yeah, it means to try or to attempt. Okay.
So that's, how would you define an essay?
Yeah, you know,
what is it?
Yeah, well,
I wrote them all the time at Westmont, but I have no idea what the...
Well, an essay is not something you need to come to a definite conclusion with, you know, and, you know, you were mentioning an essay about my grandfather that I wrote after I wrote that poem, and maybe I think the essay started with an army shirt from World War I that came
Green,
down to us. It was like this wool rag, you know, but we really prized it, and we sort of fought over it. And so most essays begin with a question, and my question was, like, why was that shirt so important to us? You know, and then why was our grandfather so important to us? And, you know, was it because of the kind of person he was, and which comes through in the poem? He's kind and sort of a jokester, or was it because he died young before we really got to know him? You know, and so the essay becomes an attempt to answer, you know, maybe this is why, or that's why, or that's why, and then it's not like a mathematical equation where you come to the answer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I have so many directions I could go here. First of all, how much of writing is built in and how much is learned?
Oh boy.
Maybe if you don't have the answer to that one, but
well, it must be some sort of dynamic interaction.
Yeah.
You know, I said before, good writing comes from good reading. I mean, we're one of the few colleges that doesn't have a writing major. We have a writing minor. But it's because we believe that, you know, you want to stock up. You want to soak yourself in good literature as or before you're writing your own. Yeah. So, I mean, I think some students at some colleges are, you know, writing too much too soon without being acquainted with what's come before them.
That makes sense. You know, when I wanted to be a broadcaster.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to be Vin Scully.
Yeah.
But he hung on too long. But when I went to see him when I was 17 years old in Candlestick Park in San Francisco, and I sat with him for 2 hours in the press box. And when I asked him what advice, what he would encourage me to do, he said, read.
Is that right?
Yeah. He said, read a lot to be a sportscaster, which I thought, that's interesting. But anyway, I digress. If you were, so here's my question. If I wanted to write a poem, and maybe you can tell us how you do it, or any thought on this. Let's say I wanted to write a poem. I've never done that before, but I want to write a poem. And let's say one of the pictures I always have in my mind is that life with God is like a rushing river. Okay? That's as far as I've gotten. If I wanted to turn that into if I wanted to think that through and write a poem about why do I think that? One, twists and turns, can't always see around the bend, problems happen, it's fresh, rivers are not toxic because they're moving. That's about all I got. What would you do?
Well, you don't need to plan out the whole poem before you write it.
Okay.
And just as you say, rivers have twists and turns, so do poems. And so, chances are you'd get 5 or 6 or 12 lines into your poem, and an image you hadn't thought of would drop in, a phrase, and it would tug you in another direction, and you'd think, no, I was going to write this poem about a river is like life with God. I can't go over here. And I'd encourage you...
But the river...
I would encourage you to go where the poem's taking you. So,
okay.
So sometimes, we have these best laid plans, as Robert Burns said, but usually a poem takes on a life of its own. And if well, there's an old dictum: no surprises for the writer, no surprises for the reader. So if the poem just goes as planned and hits all these checkpoints, it'll probably be a little lifeless, actually. But if you encounter some surprise and some new direction and go for it,
then it's going to surprise them too.
Yeah.
I like how you use humor also a lot in your work, and it seems like there's always kind of a surprise. You don't rhyme.
Not too much.
You don't use too much rhyming.
Yeah.
You said you do when you get tired.
That's right. Yeah. I did publish my last book of poems is mostly rhyme, but
you don't have to rhyme.
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, so when I think of poem, I always think of rhyme.
Sure.
And then that trips me up. But you just write it.
Yeah. Well, rhyme is fun, and but the problem with rhyme is sometimes it diverts you to not quite the exact word that you need. You're just looking for a rhyming word, an approximate word, and in free verse, which is without rhyme and definite meter, you're free to choose the exact word, and it doesn't mean that the poem doesn't have weight and shape. It still does. In any poem, the words are well chosen.
Right.
There's a memory of meter. There's a sort of rhythm to it.
Yeah.
And so it's not just prose scattered across a page. Actually, I've done most of my study in older rhyming poetry, and all of my free verse is built on that. There's memory, and you can do little repetitions of sound and half rhymes and so forth. But it's sort of like Picasso. I don't know much about art, but I've heard that Picasso was one of the best representational painters around before he started his cubism thing, sort of shaking everything up.
Right.
So
interesting.
I get students that complain about reading old rhyming poetry, and I go, no, it's good for you, even if you're writing the most avant-garde stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And so really are those the three main areas: poems, essays, and like a longer
Fiction.
novel?
Yes.
Those are the three main.
Mm-hmm.
And you would say poetry is the one you're most drawn to, but you tried to stretch yourself to do the others.
I think the different genres help each other out. I started writing fantasy novels, eco-fantasy novels. They're collected in a volume called The Alpine Tales.
Right.
And then I remember when I finished graduate school and went to my first job out in New York, I thought, well, who am I going to be? Am I going to be a scholar, or an inspirational chapel speaker, or a novelist? And I thought, well, I'll be everything, because C.S. Lewis was everything. and then it wasn't too many months into my first job that I thought, oh, I'm just not as smart as C.S. Lewis, and he didn't have little kids, and he wasn't teaching multiple sections of freshman composition.
Right.
You gotta.
Right.
And I had some new friends in the department who were poets, and I started writing a little poetry, and that got interesting, and poetry is an art of compression, and as I got better as a poet, my novels started getting shorter.
Right.
And then I had a colleague at Westmont that said, don't forget about the essay.
Yeah.
And so once in a while I'll get a compliment on a narrative element to my poems, or a lyrical element to my essays, and these things help each other.
Yeah.
Shakespeare, I believe, wanted to be a poet more than he wanted to be a playwright. And we're in the middle of a pandemic now, but early in his career there was a plague for 2 years and the theater shut down. He probably wrote his 154 sonnets and 2 long narrative poems then, and
Wow.
dedicated them to patrons, hoped to be supported. You know, the money didn't quite come, plague was over, went back to writing plays, maybe even regretfully. But the plays he wrote after the plague, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Richard II, are among the most lyrical that he ever wrote. And his whole life, he wrote far more lyrically than he needed to entertain people on the stage, you know. And an opposite example would be Robert Browning, the Victorian poet, who started as a playwright and in the 1830s, and his plays would last 1 or 2 nights on the stage. That was it, you know. And then he eloped with Elizabeth Barrett, and they went to Italy. Nobody wanted his plays in Italy, so he wrote poems, and he invented this kind of poem called the Dramatic Monologue, where you get a single speaker in a sort of dramatic setting, and he became one of the most famous poets. But he failed as a playwright.
Isn't that interesting?
You know, but he succeeded as a poet because he failed as a playwright. And I love these examples. C.S. Lewis wanted to be a poet. He's an okay poet, but it's probably the least of his abilities.
Right.
I would say he's best as an essayist, and what makes him a great essayist is his amazing analogies, right? And what's an analogy but a dressed-up metaphor that he learned, you know, trying to write poetry.
Wow.
Yeah. James Joyce wanted to be a poet. William Faulkner wanted to be a poet. But look what they did with their failed poetry and prose.
Isn't that amazing?
So,
wow, that is fascinating.
So I think, and maybe this is a broader life lesson, but I don't think there are any real dead ends in life.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
You know, our failures feed our successes that come later.
Right.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So there's maybe we can take some hope in the the quarantine. It's a good time to write. Maybe some people will come up with a hidden ability.
Well, yeah.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
You know, we're already out of time, and I haven't gotten to, like, any of my questions, so we're going to have you back. But I wanted to say one thing, because I just feel like there's great. I read this scripture last night from Jeremiah 30:12. Write all the words which I have spoken to you in a book. And of course, I think it's Habakkuk, it talks about write it down. And I just feel like there's something powerful about the written word. And, you know, we talked about technology and, things are devices and this and that. But, of course, the Word of God, you know, is not going away. There seems like there's something permanent and powerful and lasting when you put that pen to paper.
Yeah, there must be.
Yeah. Do you think about that ever? Because that's,
well, you know, a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets make this claim, and it's a claim that goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, that literature lasts, poetry lasts. It's a way of, and the Greeks and Romans had no very firm idea of the afterlife, so they thought if you were going to live on, if you were going to be eternal in some sense, it would be through a poem.
Right.
And but I maybe to bend the conversation a little differently, there's a line in Macbeth, give sorrow words, and one of the oldest, I think, motives for writing is to work through grief and sorrow, difficulty, trouble, try to arrive at some consolation. You know, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." You know, we have to go through the mourning, and again, back to the pandemic, and this is a difficult time for many people, and I think, what do the French say? You must suffer to be beautiful. So there is the writing that addresses distress is the oldest and deepest kind of writing.
Wow.
And one of the great tools we have as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, we'll have to end there. We didn't get to more of your poetry. I'd love to have you back. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. There's so much more I wanted to ask you, and we'll do it again if you're willing. But the book is All in a Garden Green. Dr. Willis, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dean.
Yeah, thank you, and we'll see you next time.